All right, so the subject of today's lecture is mainly decolonization, and we're going to look at a number of both wider theoretical considerations, and then we're going to look at a number of countries where decolonization took place. But before we get to that, because we're really talking here now about the post-World War II period, and I want you to recall that this entire week what we've been doing is we've been looking at the emergence of a new political and economic order in the aftermath of World War II. So recall that you have the United Nations, you have the Security Council, General Assembly, and you have a number of other organizations which form part of the United Nations. And you also have, of course, institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. We also looked at, of course, the Cold War, and some of what we're going to consider now in the lecture today, when we look at decolonization, has, of course, a relationship to the Cold War, because both the Soviet Union and the United States, the two principal powers in the post-World War II period, were countries that had a certain kind of investment in the issues of colonies. Now, when I say investment, I don't mean necessarily economic investment. What I mean is obviously a kind of a political investment, social, cultural, philosophical investment, because one of the interesting questions that arises when you look at colonialism is that you find out that in many countries that were colonized, particularly during the latter period of colonialism. So let's say if you look at Algeria in the 40s and 50s, well, these colonies were not necessarily profitable to the European power that held the colonies. In the case of Algeria, it was, of course, France. France also held other parts of French North Africa, right? What's called the Maghreb, Tunisia, Morocco. And you find that the French were not necessarily benefiting economically from the colony in the 1950s, but they're still holding on to it. So, and that's one reason why it's important to understand this idea of investment, that there can be an emotional, philosophical investment. It's a form of cultural capital. All right? But before we move into really all of that, I want to sort of step back into the United States for a moment, because we don't have a special session here for what's happening in the 1950s and 1960s. What you have, of course, is what's known as the American Civil Rights Movement, which formally really begins, it is often said, with the refusal of Rosa Parks, right, to vacate the seat from a segregated bus. And then we know that it led to eventually what's called the Montgomery bus boycott, and the Montgomery bus boycott is what's going to bring Martin Luther King to the attention of the entire country. 1959, 3 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King is going to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He's going to be assassinated in 1968. We know that the 1960s was a period of intense turmoil in the United States, and particularly in the American South, where there were assassinations, people were disappearing, civil rights workers would just disappear. You had the White Citizens Council, which is comparable to the KKK. Very few people have heard of the White Citizens Council in comparison with the KKK, because the KKK became this synonymous with regime of white terror. But there were also organizations such as White Citizens Council, right? So when we're looking at all of this, we need to keep in mind several considerations. That the enterprise of decolonization doesn't seem to apply to the US, but effectively you can think about segregation as something, a desegregation as related to decolonization. That this was America's form of decolonization. Because what did it do? What was the outcome of the civil rights movement? The outcome in legal terms was that in 1964, 1965, and 1968 you had 3 acts. Most people have forgotten the third act completely, the 1968 Act, which was a Fair Housing Rights Act. Right? But 1964 and 65 were the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And what it did was it actually put teeth into the Constitution, because the Constitution, of course, forbids discrimination on the grounds of race. And of course, we know that in the aftermath of the Civil War, African Americans were finally able to gain some kind of formal citizenship. And I think you always have to distinguish, not just in the US, but in every country, you have to distinguish between formal citizenship and citizenship on the ground. You can have rights on paper, but they may not actually translate into rights that you are able to exercise on the ground. And that was effectively the position of African Americans. And that's one reason I had you read James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, because Baldwin was one of the most articulate, ferocious voices in the American sphere. Right? And if you look at this text and think about it, reflect on it, what Baldwin is really arguing is a number of different things. I just want to highlight a couple of features, and again, I want to reiterate what I just said a few minutes ago, that this is not simply a way of saying that, okay, we're going to just look at the civil rights movement because, after all, everyone in this room is in some ways a beneficiary of this movement, particularly minorities. And I think the first thing I want to stress is the fact that if you're a colored person, it doesn't matter whether you're African American or Indian American or Chinese American or Korean American or whatever the case may be. Every colored person in particular benefited from the American Civil Rights Movement. All the ethnic groups were able to ride on its back, because what it attempted to do was to establish not just equality for black people. It put forward the idea that this is no longer a country that can be dominated simply by the history of white people. Right? And that we cannot really think of the United States as a country that is predominantly white or that is cast in the mold of whiteness. Right? Now, James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, a couple of the central arguments are of interest to us, because one of the things he attempts to establish, and you don't have to obviously accept the argument, but I want to just read the last portion of page 44, going into page 45. But in order to deal, he says, and I'm quoting him, with the untapped and dormant force of the previously subjugated, in order to survive as a human, moving, moral weight in the world, America and all the Western nations will be forced to re-examine themselves and release themselves from many things that are now taken to be sacred, and to discard nearly all the assumptions that have been used to justify their lives and their anguish and their crimes so long. Right? So what he's saying here is, number one, that when we really look at the question of racism, racism began in the minds of white people, and it will have to end in the minds of white people. It is not for anyone else, for colored people. Yes, you can have, solidarity and all of that, and you can also have interfaith groups and this and that. But what James Baldwin is saying is that the origins of racism lie in Western civilization and in the United States. And this civilization was shaped by the ethos of the white man. And so fundamentally, it's going to be up to the white man. If we're going to get a resolution to the question of racism, the white man will have to fundamentally resolve this issue. Right? Which of course doesn't mean that others shouldn't be doing what they need to do, but that something that originated in the minds of white people will have to end over there. And that means, in turn, number two, that it is not enough to pass a Voting Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act, a Fair Housing Rights Act, and all of that. And we've seen that 50 years after the passage of these acts, we have seen that 1 out of every 7 black men in this country will go through the prison system. Right? And we know that one of the reasons that so many of them will go through the prison system is because essentially what was given with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, was on the other hand taken away. And incarceration rates in this country of black people start to go up after the passage of these acts. You should try to understand the relationship between the two. Right? So what he's suggesting is that this is a systemic problem, and it is intrinsic to this civilization. Right? And he doesn't mince words. He says the West will have to discard nearly all the assumptions about racism, superiority, hierarchies, that have been used to justify their lives and their anguish and their crimes so long. And then what he's going to do in the next subsequent pages and in the pages around there, that section is very important. What he also does is he implicates Christianity, because he makes a distinction, as Tolstoy did, in his own way, between, except here he makes a distinction between the teachings of Christ and Pauline Christianity, and he says that what actually passes down for Christianity in the United States is really the Christianity of a man who was a fanatic. Those are his words, right? It was a fanatic. That's what he was. Now, again, we're not in a theological seminar trying to understand all the nuances about Paul, all right? But this certainly is Baldwin's view, and I'm suggesting to you that we should view this in the context of decolonization, because when we're speaking about decolonization, what we're really speaking about is not just removing European powers from the colonies that they occupied. We're speaking about the decolonization of the mind. Fundamentally, we're speaking about the decolonization of the mind. And it is not only those who were colonized people who need to be decolonized. It is the West that needs to decolonize itself. Right? And that was, of course, I think, as you will recall, the argument of Gandhi in Hind Swaraj as well. Right? There are very interesting ways in which you can tie in Baldwin with Gandhi, although there are no straightforward links, as they are, for example, with another great African-American intellectual, a gigantic figure such as W.B. Du Bois, where you can see the links, because Du Bois had a correspondence. He wrote 15 articles on Gandhi, Right? But nonetheless, I'm saying that it's the same sensibility. All right? Now, I also want to, when we're looking at the 50s and the 60s in the United States, let's not forget what Eisenhower said. It's almost become a cliche, frankly, the military-industrial complex. But simply because it's a cliche, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider it. Because what is he saying here? And this, if you look at this, this is a quotation from his farewell speech to the nation, where he alerts the country to what he calls the dangers of the military-industrial complex. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence is felt in every city, every state house, etc. Right? What he's saying is that the military has permeated every pore of American society. And that, and of course, what you're speaking about is a society that is highly militaristic. And of course, he's also suggesting, without elaborating upon it, that's what people have had to do over the years, just try to understand what are the implications of the military-industrial complex. But he's also suggesting that when you have an economy which is so heavily geared towards the military establishment, it really, in a way, suffocates other kinds of possibilities. Right? And what happens, of course, is that this militarism infuses civil society. You know, for example, I'll give you a very simple illustration of how the military-industrial complex works today. I'm not speaking only about, obviously, the military budget of the United States, $750 billion US, which dwarfs the budget of every other country in the world. All right? I'm not speaking simply about that. I'm speaking about the fact that increasingly on American streets, the police have been given weapons that are military grade. The excess arms and ammunition, and you know, in the military, they upgrade very, very quickly. These all filter down to the police forces of American cities. And what you have really is a militaristic structure of American policing. And that is a very good illustration of the insidiousness of this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower was warning about in 1961. So when we're looking at the 1960s, before we turn our attention to the rest of the world, 50s and 60s, this is what you have to keep in mind. You have to keep in mind that you're talking about a country that is extremely prosperous. And of course, there were other kinds of developments, such as the development of the American suburb and what its implications were. Right? A lot of work has been done by social historians on these kinds of things. You know, because if you're looking at, for example, problems of alienation and loneliness, you know, I think I might have mentioned in this class, I don't know if I did, but in Britain, for example, they appointed a minister of loneliness last year, right? Well, in the US, you have even a graver problem of this kind of alienation and loneliness. And I can tell you, the suburb had a good deal to contribute to it as well. So when you're looking at architecture and social history, then you have to look at the psychological implications of that. So the 1950s, 60s were a period of immense, early 60s was a period of immense prosperity for the United States. You had the threat of nuclear annihilation, yes, and there was a Cold War, but the US economy was absolutely booming at that point in time. And the US was by far the most prosperous country in the world. All right. On the other hand, you had extraordinary forms of discrimination which were entrenched in law, in legal systems, and had a wide acceptability in American civil society. And then you also had, as I've said, the military-industrial complex and the particular manner in which it had infiltrated every pore of American society. Right? That's the scenario that you have to think about when you're thinking of the US. Now, I want to, before I launch into decolonization, also want to look at one figure, Paul Robeson. Extraordinary figure. Completely forgotten for a long period of time. Lived from 1898 to 1976. Even the phrase Renaissance man, which is another cliche, doesn't do him justice. He was far more than a Renaissance man. He was an American athlete, a singer, actor, a civil rights activist. He was considered the most outstanding college athlete of his day. All right? And in a number of sports, not just in one. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. He joined the volunteer brigade against the fascist forces, against Franco's forces. And he lends his name to many of these third world solidarity and decolonization movement. So I'm looking at him both in the context of decolonization and in the context of the Cold War, you know, because he's going to become a victim in part of this Cold War. He's a very strong proponent of anti-imperialism. Although he's not a member of the Communist Party, he definitely had communist leanings. And then he's going to be placed on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. That is, the American Communist Party is going to be put on that list. And the state argued that he was implicated in it as well, although, as I've said, he was not formally a member of the American Communist Party. He's a critic of American foreign policy, a very consistent critic. And of course, he made his name more than anything else in theater, in cinema. So, for example, there's this role that he plays, Othello, and he's the first black man to play that role, 300 consecutive shows, right? I mean, he was a person who was really, as I said, a person who was renowned throughout the world. Right? However, he runs into difficulties. The difficulties have to do with his political affiliations, his strong expressions of solidarity with the Third World or with the global South. And yes, I think that there was a political miscalculation on his part too, because like many on the left, he didn't fully understand or acknowledge the perils of Stalinism. I think there's no question about that. I think that he didn't fully understand it and refused to believe what was happening in Stalin's Russia. And of course, the Russians lionized him. I mean, they received him. He went to Russia a number of times, and he was always received with extraordinary warmth. Would always get a fantastic reception over there. So he's going to be blacklisted as un-American. One of the conferences that he went to, which I'm going to turn to in just a moment, that he wanted to go to was the great iconic conference, which is known as the Bandung Conference of 1955. And he couldn't go to it because his passport had been illegally withheld by the United States government. And this passport was, in fact, actually not returned to him until a Supreme Court decision, which is mentioned over here, called Kent versus Dulles in 1958, which ruled that the state had acted unjustly in impounding his passport. All right? And you have to really read his testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a committee that was chaired by Joseph McCarthy. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with the name here. And they have an exchange which is really extraordinary because Joseph McCarthy is telling him about American values and virtues and oppression. And Robeson tells him, of course, that you can't tell me a thing about oppression. I'm a black man. What do you know about oppression? Right? And he just devastated McCarthy. If you read that, it's just an extraordinary display. So this is him. Extraordinarily handsome man, and as I said, lionized throughout the world. But what happened was that because of his communist sympathies, he's going to be blacklisted. His passport, as I've said, is revoked. And he's going to be completely marginalized. When he died in 1976, he had been largely forgotten, right? And this is actually a cartoon that was done. It'll be made available to you, so you can take a little look. You can take a look at it in greater detail later on. And this is him playing Othello. That's Desdemona, of course, and the Shakespeare play. And this is a record of Negro folk songs, a record released by Robeson. He had a majestic voice. What I suggest is you go to Google and just listen to Old Man River. This is his most famous song, right? Extraordinarily majestic voice. So this is a record in Russian, which of course tells you what kind of cultural capital and mileage he had. And of course we have to understand that for the Russians he was great propaganda too, right? Because throughout the Cold War, the Russians always attempted to highlight racism in America. So whenever America would come forward and say, hey, you're a totalitarian state in international forums, the Russians would immediately respond and say, well, what's happening in the American South? What about Jim Crow laws? How do you treat your own minorities? Right? And so this is not, there's no innocence here. That's what I'm talking about. But Paul Robeson, by the way, he was also a linguist. He sang in 20 languages, right? And spoke 10 languages. So this is a record called Negro Folk Songs, released in the then Soviet Union, of his songs. And of course, America is masterful at this. What do you think they did? 20 years later, oh yes, we're apologetic, we made a mistake. He was a great man, so you release a postage stamp, Black Heritage, and you put Robeson right there. Now he's been rehabilitated, right? This is one of the ways in which, obviously, dissent is completely squashed in this country. That whenever you have a dissenter, first you marginalize that person, bury that person, and then what you do is, at a safe distance, 20, 30 years later, then you lionize them. Put up a statue, postage stamp, whatever works. Right? So this is a postage stamp released by the United States in 2004 of Paul Robeson. All right. This is not Paul Robeson. This is Sukarno. And that brings me to the principal segment, decolonization. Who is Sukarno? Sukarno is a president of the Republic of Indonesia. right? And he had been a major figure in the anti-colonial movement in Indonesia. He formed a party which was a nationalist anti-colonial party. Of course, he was imprisoned by the Dutch because Indonesia was under Dutch rule. And Indonesia declared independence in 1945, but didn't actually win independence until 1950. There were many places where they would proclaim independence, but the colonial forces were still there. And it took several more years before the Dutch had to evacuate Indonesia. And he is the host. The reason why he's important here simply is because he is the host of this great meeting that is going to take place in Bandung, which is in Java, in Indonesia, in 1955. April 1955. It's the site of what is called the Afro-Asian Conference. Now, 29 countries were met at that conference. So this does not include any Western power, right? And it does not include any Latin American country. This is a conference of countries from Africa and Asia. 1955, large parts of the world were still not decolonized. You'll see a map very shortly which will show you the extent of decolonization. And the first country that is going to really get decolonized. So if you look at this map over here, this is a map which shows you sort of decolonization globally. So you can see here India and Pakistan, of course, is partitioned, as I had explained before, from India. And so 1947, Burma 1948. And in each case, wherever decolonization took place, you have the date. And there are more detailed maps, one for Asia, one for Africa, so that you can study these at your leisure. But here you see decolonization in Asia. So before 1950, you have India and Burma and Sri Lanka. That is what is now called South Asia. And then you're going to have other countries, and mainly in the period between 1950 and 1959, right? Some of this state formation will continue to take place through the 60s, as in the case of the forming of Singapore, when Singapore is going to segregate itself from the Malay Federation, right? And over here, you see decolonization in Africa. And in Africa, the bulk of it really took place in the 1960s. In the 1950s, you had very little. You had Libya over here. If you look, for example, Algeria, 62, Morocco, Mali, right? So you can see 1960, 60, 58 over here, and then 62, 62, 63, Kenya, so forth and so on. So basically a little bit later than what really transpired in Asia. Now, this means that in 1955, when this conference took place, the Bandung Conference, a substantial portion of Africa was still not decolonized. Now, how do we understand what happened at Bandung? First and foremost, there had been many conferences preceding this conference of people from the colonized world. But Bandung was still singular. It was singular because the conferences that had taken place prior to 1955 had taken place largely in European countries. So, for example, in 1927, you had what was called the League Against Imperialism. And this league met in Brussels in 1927. Right? You had a meeting, by the way, in New Delhi called the Asian Relations Conference. But this was mainly Asian countries, and this was before India became free. Because this was in early 1947. India became free on August 15th, 1947. So the importance of Bandung is that this is the first time that people from 29 countries from Asia and Africa who together constituted 60% of the world's population, these 29 countries. Why 60%, even though there are 29 countries? Because China and India were both present at the conference. And China and India were, of course, the two most populous countries in the world then, as they are today. Right? So this is the first time in history that these countries met without the mediation of a European power. And I want you to try to now think, I'm going to try to help you think through the implications of that down to the present day. And there's something I know that I've mentioned in this class before. And now I think I'll mention it again because now it will resonate, I hope, differently. And what I've mentioned before is the fact that if you really look at countries such as India, Vietnam, China, or you look at Latin American countries such as Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, or Central America, and African countries, what kind of conversation do people in these countries have with each other? None. For example, as an Indian writer, I know from hundreds of people I know in India that the vast majority of them are extremely well versed, if they're educated people, of course, they're well versed in the history of India, and they're well versed in the history of Europe. Most Indian intellectuals will have a considerable acquaintance with the history of Britain and the history of Europe, and particularly the history of European intellectual thought. All right? But how many of them would have read a writer from Brazil, or a writer from Sudan, or Congo, or Cameroon? None. How many writers from India have people in Cameroon, or Sudan, or Congo read? None. And when these people meet, where do they meet? They meet right here. They meet on the campus of the American university, which gets a huge number of foreign students. So what's happening? These conversations are always mediated by the white superstructure. They're mediated by European thought. What I have in common with intellectuals from the global south is the fact that we've all read Marx and we've all read Freud. Right? And I'm picking the two most obvious figures. I could pick another 20, and some of you will not be familiar, but we've all read Foucault, for example, or Derrida. Right? All European thinkers. That's what we have in common. And what Bandung was trying to do was trying to put people into conversation without having European culture mediate that conversation. It was also a way of recalling the fact that before India and before Africa had contact with the West, they had contact with each other. For centuries, they had contacts with each other. I cannot even tell you how strong the links were between Iran and India. Right? Persian culture permeated India. And Indian figures were exceedingly well known in Iran. And one could go on in this vein indefinitely. Right? So this is how you have to start thinking about Bandung. Bandung is not just, all right, what it's doing, it's signifying this moment of decolonization, saying that now these countries are coming to the fore, the age of empire is over. The age of Europe is over. Right? And we are now going to try to understand each other. So, of course, what also made it possible for them to get together is that they all had shared histories of anti-colonial struggle and opposition to racism and racialism. Right? Those were some of the things that they had in common too. They all had the experience of being colonized. And here I'm speaking about colonization again in every sense of the term. Political colonization, economic colonization, intellectual colonization. And I want to take you back once again as a reminder. You can see where these things link up with other elements of the course. That when we were looking at British rule in India, one of the things I stressed was the epistemological conquest of India. Right? That the British put into place a massive apparatus for understanding Indian society. Because what they were effectively trying to do was to supplant Indian ways of thinking with their own ways of thinking. And that's where Macaulay's 1835 minute, which you read on Indian education, if you recall my discussion, was precisely about that. Because what did Macaulay say? That we want to put into place, we want to create a class of Indians who are going to be English in everything except, of course, blood. They're going to be English in sentiment, in feeling, in taste. One hopes not culinary taste, because that would be a horrible experience. Then all you'd be doing is eating really bad English food like mashed potatoes and steak and kidney pie and boiled peas and carrots. You know, as I've often argued, one of the reasons why the British had to colonize India was because at least they could eat well for a change. Right? So what we're talking about is this was effectively a history that goes back much earlier, but now that is this history of the anti-colonial impulse in a way. Right? And this Bandung moment is reviving also these kinds of links which have been eviscerated, wiped out by the long history of colonialism. All right? And here you have a photograph of some of the people at the Bandung Conference, and here you have Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, one of the prime movers of that, and of course you can see from the plaque over here Indonesia's leader. And here this was a festive moment, and this is Nasser, one of the major hosts. Nasser is the president of Egypt, you know, and of course a year after this you're going to have the Suez crisis, right? The Suez Canal crisis, and Nehru over here, and this is the Burmese leader. Now, let's look concretely at decolonization. All right, and we want to look at three instances, at least two I hope to cover today, and we might just rest with that. So 1945, Sukarno declares Indonesia free. I'm just giving you a general chronology, and then I'm going to look at a little bit more detail. And as you saw from the maps before, you have the independence of India and the creation of Pakistan in 47, followed by the independence of Burma, Ceylon. Ceylon is now called Sri Lanka, Korea, and Malaysia. And if you recall my discussion of China, that you had the PRC, the communists are finally going to prevail in the civil war that takes place between them and the nationalists are going to basically be driven to Taiwan, right? And that's where the Republic of China is going to be. So that's the second China, and of course then you have the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and Indonesia is going to be finally recognized. You know, Indonesia had declared its independence, but Holland had actually refused to recognize that. And if you look at that, you'll get a few more details. The portion that I put in red is important there because what was taking place at the same time was an attempt by both the United States and the Soviet. Remember, now that you're in the thick of the Cold War, so the US is forging a number of these alliances. Some of them are military pacts, some of them are political and military pacts together. Some of them have an economic component. So you have, for example, SEATO, which is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, where the US and some Western powers are going to try to link countries such as Philippines and Thailand with the West. And then you have the Central Treaty Organization known as the Baghdad Pact. There was a time, unbelievable though it sounds, when the US actually had friendly alliances with countries such as Iraq and Iran. All right? And this is also in the mid-1950s. Right? And then in 1955, you have, of course, the Bandung Conference held between April 18th and 23. Right? So before we get into the case studies, let me try to unravel some of the other implications of Bandung. So one of the things that Bandung signified was the unity of the Third World, or the Global South, as we call it now, arising from anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. It was also a rejection of the two-camp theory of world politics. The two camps obviously being the US and its allies, constituting the NATO Pact, and then, of course, the Soviet Union and its allies constituting the Warsaw Pact. And it was the initiation of non-alignment as an ideological force in world politics. I want to underscore the fact that non-alignment should not be confused with neutrality. It usually is. There are certainly cases where non-alignment and neutrality coincided, but it was not neutrality. The countries that were non-aligned generally were friendly either to the US or to the Soviet Union. But they still took the view that there had to be a third force in world politics. That these countries were countries which were saying, we cannot be held hostage to this war that is going on between the United States and the Soviet Union, what is called the Cold War. Of course, it was hot in many places, such as Korea and subsequently in Vietnam and Algeria. Right? But we cannot be held hostage to this. And that is why I'm stressing the fact that these countries were not necessarily neutral. Now, I can tell you, for example, I'll give you my illustration, the illustration of myself growing up in India, and you'll see the complexity of this. That India was the leader of the non-aligned movement, principal force there. But when I was growing up in India in the 1960s and 1970s, the official ideology of the Indian state made it closer to the Soviet Union, because the United States was friendly to Pakistan, and of course India and Pakistan were foes, as they are today. Right? So the US is siding with Pakistan, the Soviet Union is siding with India. And the school I went to, which was the school founded by an English woman who had come to India shortly before independence with a very English name called Springdale's, okay, English medium school. This school that I went to, you know, in the morning assembly period, very often we would have visitors from the Soviet Union. Okay? And it was allied. But if you look at popular culture among the educated classes, such as my family, everyone read only American literature and American comics, Archie comics, you know? I mean, figures like Archie and Jughead have been running through my mind for 50 plus years, you know? Right? The television shows you watched, American, to the extent that one watched foreign shows, because you only had one TV channel in India for decades, state-run. But to the extent that you watch foreign shows, to the extent that one watched foreign films, it was always American films. America completely dominated the imagination. I didn't have to come to the United States to be really familiar with the Rolling Stones, Deep Purple, Bob Dylan. No, all of this was familiar to me long before I came to this country. In my early teens, I already knew about all of these and was listening to this music. And that was true of nearly everyone who came from my class background. So you see, a country could be officially aligned to the Soviet Union, but there is no question that America hogged the imagination. All right? Now, Bandung did not rest on commonalities except the commonality of racial discrimination that people had suffered, and it rested, of course, on the whole platform of anti-colonialism as well, that the people who were there, the countries that were gathered at Bandung, were countries that had been colonized. And what Bandung did was it also provided the seeds for further groupings. In the United Nations itself, for example, there are all these groupings, you know, and these have to do with countries that were formerly colonized, which now form a bloc very often. And Bandung also had other implications, such as the fact that it led to a call for disarmament. And international agencies, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, actually grew out of Bandung. The countries that were gathered there also, of course, were countries that were advocating for economic independence and for development of indigenous manufacturing. But Bandung was compromised by two things, both of which I have discussed in this class in substantial detail. What were the two things it was compromised by? One, the ideology of development. That every country that was at Bandung was a country that was on the road to development. And then, of course, you have to think back about the critique of development that I had that I had put forward before you, because the whole idea was that we were going to do this kind of nation building, and when we do this nation building, well, it may be that some people are going to fall by the side. Some people may have to sacrifice their lives in the interest of developing our nation. And the second thing it was compromised by was the very ideology of the nation state. That even as these countries formed blocks with each other and said, we're going to think coherently as units, right? Colored people of the world unite kind of scenario. Nonetheless, it became very clear as events unfolded, not just at Bandung, but as they unfolded in the decade thereafter, that every country was completely bound to the ideology of the nation state. That is, that its own national self-interest always overrode everything else. Right? And so Bandung wasn't properly able to address that problem. Now, when we look at decolonization, let's look at the case of Algeria. I think that's all I'll have time for today. Very briefly, it'll just take a couple of minutes. But look at this quotation. Remarkable. 1944. This is the official French view as embodied in what's called the Brazzaville Declaration. The colonizing work of France makes it impossible to accept any idea of autonomy for the colonies or any possibility of development outside the French Empire. I mean, what chic, you say, what arrogance. The French are saying it's inconceivable that in our empire anyone should be thinking of decolonization. Even at a distant date, there will be no self-government in the colonies because these people, of course, are not fit to govern themselves. And if you think, by the way, that now France has become wiser after the fact, I want to tell you that 12 years ago in France they passed a law which made it mandatory to teach in all French schools the beneficial effects of colonization. The law was subsequently overturned because there was a huge uproar. Right? But that was the case. And if you go to my blog, you'll find a number of articles there. You just put in the search function and you'll find them where I discuss this. All right? Algeria was a very difficult case. Colonized in the early 1830s, it was an overseas department of France. Right? Here we are not going to look at the differences between French colonialism and British colonialism. But one fundamental thing is that the French, this is what is called a settler colony. Nowadays, settler colonialism has become a big subject of study. Because there was a French settler population known as the colons or the colonists, also known as Algerians. Here's another irony. The French are known as the Algerians. The native population, which was 90%, were not known as Algerians. They were known as Arabs or as Muslims. All right? And these colonists were also known as the Pied Noirs, the black feet ones, mainly Catholics. About 130,000 of them were Algerian Jews. They constituted 10% of the population, the white settlers, but owned 27% of the arable land. And of course, you think to yourself, that's quite unfair and quite unjust. But if you think that that is unjust, just think of this one here. In Kenya, 30,000 white settlers who constituted 1/4 or 1% of the population of Kenya owned 33% of the arable land. Many of these conflicts were based on what was really the outright theft of land by colonial powers. All right? And so you had these racial hierarchies, and what you're going to have in Algeria is you're going to eventually have in 1954 a war which is going to become a guerrilla war initiated by what is called the FLN, which is a resistance movement, and eventually it's going to crumble. The French, that is the French Empire in Algeria, is going to crumble. In 1962, Algeria is going to acquire its independence. And most of the French settlers, 90% of the French settlers, are going to migrate back to France. Now, I'll say a few more things about it in my next lecture. I'll look at one more case of decolonization, and we'll move on to the next segment. So we're more or less really on schedule at the moment. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see that. All right?